When a man suddenly becomes silent, the first instinct many people feel is fear. The mind immediately begins creating questions, searching for explanations, and trying to understand what changed. Just days before, the conversation may have been effortless. Messages came naturally, attention felt genuine, and the connection seemed to be growing. Then, without warning, the energy shifts. The replies become slower, the conversations shorter, and sometimes the silence becomes complete. In that moment, the mind often assumes the worst, believing that something must have gone wrong. But silence does not always begin because feelings disappear. In many situations, it begins because emotions have become more complicated than the person expected. When a connection starts becoming meaningful, it can trigger a reaction that many people do not talk about. Real emotional connection creates vulnerability. Vulnerability means that someone suddenly has something to lose. For a person who is not used to dealing openly with emotions, that realization can feel overwhelming. Many men grow up learning to manage emotions privately rather than expressing them immediately. When they feel confused, pressured, or uncertain about what they are feeling, their instinct is not always to talk about it. Instead, they create distance so they can think clearly without outside influence. Silence becomes a way to slow everything down. It gives them the opportunity to analyze what they feel without the pressure of responding instantly to another person's emotions. During this time, the silence may appear cold or distant, but internally something different may be happening. The mind begins reviewing the connection, remembering conversations, evaluating whether the feelings developing are temporary attraction or something deeper. This process often requires mental space because strong emotions can cloud judgment when someone feels constantly pulled into conversation or emotional intensity. Another reason silence appears is because of internal conflict. A man may feel genuine attraction and connection, but at the same time, he may feel uncertain about whether he is ready for the responsibility that comes with emotional commitment. Relationships require consistency, attention, and emotional availability. If someone feels unsure about their ability to offer those things, stepping back can feel like the only way to regain control of the situation. Silence can also appear when a man feels overwhelmed by expectations. If every conversation begins to carry emotional weight, if every small change in communication creates questions or tension, he may begin associating the connection with pressure instead of comfort. When that happens, the mind looks for relief, and distance becomes the easiest solution. This does not necessarily mean that the connection itself is unwanted. It may simply mean that the emotional pace of the relationship moved faster than he was prepared to handle. Silence becomes his way of creating space so that the intensity can settle. What often makes the situation more complicated is how the silence is interpreted. When someone feels emotionally attached, silence can feel like rejection or abandonment. The natural reaction is to try harder to reconnect. Messages become more frequent. Questions become more direct. The desire to restore the previous level of communication becomes urgent. But this reaction can unintentionally reinforce the distance. When someone is already feeling overwhelmed, increased emotional pressure can make the situation feel even heavier. Instead of encouraging communication, it may push the person further into silence. Human psychology often responds differently to calmness than to pressure. When silence is met with emotional stability rather than panic, the entire dynamic begins to shift. A person who expected a strong emotional reaction may instead notice patience and self-control. That response communicates something powerful. It shows that the other person values the connection but does not depend on it for their emotional stability. This kind of response creates space for reflection rather than resistance. Without pressure, the person who went silent may begin observing the situation differently. He may start recognizing that the woman he stepped away from is not reacting with desperation or fear. Instead, she continues living her life with confidence and independence. That realization can change perception in an important way. Emotional independence signals strength. Strength naturally commands respect. When someone shows that their happiness is not dependent on constant communication, they appear more balanced and secure. In many cases, silence eventually ends because curiosity replaces avoidance. The person who stepped back begins wondering about the emotional strength they are observing. Instead of feeling responsible for someone else's emotions, they begin feeling drawn towards someone who clearly respects herself enough to remain calm even in uncertain moments. This is why understanding silence is important. Silence is not always a clear message of rejection. Sometimes it is a moment of emotional processing, a response to pressure, or a reflection of someone's uncertainty about their own feelings. The way silence is handled often determines what direction the relationship will take next. Emotional stability in uncertain moments reveals strength. and strength changes how people see the connection they once stepped away from. Many men struggle with expressing emotions, especially when they feel uncertain or overwhelmed by the depth of a connection. Silence becomes a tool to regain control over their emotional state. It allows them to process thoughts without the immediate pressure of responding, without the constant expectation of explaining themselves. When someone is forced to think, to reflect, and to process independently, the mind naturally begins evaluating the value of the connection and the role they want to play in it. This silence is rarely random. It is often triggered when feelings begin to carry weight. When attraction or emotional attachment deepens, it can create hesitation because it requires responsibility, commitment, and vulnerability. Vulnerability is uncomfortable, especially for those who are not accustomed to sharing emotions openly. The instinct is to step back, to pause, to retreat into mental space where decisions can be made without influence or distraction. In these moments, the mind replays memories, actions, and conversations. He begins analyzing how he has interacted with you, what your attention and energy mean, and what it would feel like if the connection were lost. Reflection grows stronger in silence because there is no external noise, no constant conversation, no reassurance to distract the mind from truth. The very absence of communication forces awareness. Silence also appears when someone experiences fear of inadequacy. They may genuinely care, but they question whether they can meet the expectations of a meaningful connection. Relationships demand emotional availability, patience, and effort, and when someone doubts their ability to provide that consistently, withdrawal feels like a safer alternative than risking conflict, rejection, or failure. This pattern often intensifies when the relationship has previously been fueled by emotional pursuit. If one person consistently chases attention, seeks reassurance, or tries to maintain the connection at all costs, the other person can feel the weight of that effort. It may create a sense of pressure, whether conscious or subconscious. Emotional pressure can feel restrictive, and silence becomes the natural response to regain equilibrium. The most important thing to recognize about this silence is that it is not always a reflection of diminished feelings. On the contrary, it can indicate a deep emotional response. The mind often reacts more intensely to uncertainty than to absence. When someone feels emotionally conflicted, unsure of their next step, or vulnerable to the reality of their emotions, silence allows them to confront the situation internally. During this period of withdrawal, observation and reflection occur simultaneously. He may begin noticing your independence, your confidence, and the way you carry yourself without being consumed by his attention or reactions. That realization can create a new kind of attraction. Emotional independence signals strength, stability, and self-respect, qualities that human psychology is naturally drawn to. Silence also forces emotional contrast. When someone who was once constantly available stops responding in the way they once did, the dynamic changes. Absence highlights presence, and calm detachment highlights the value of attention. The more balanced, composed, and self-assured your response to silence, the more it forces him to recognize what he may have taken for granted. What often follows is curiosity. The initial withdrawal may have felt confusing or frustrating, but as he reflects, the mind begins analyzing the connection more clearly. Memories are replayed, actions are reconsidered, and the emotional weight of what has been lost or taken lightly becomes apparent. Silence allows him to face reality in a way that constant communication rarely permits. This reflection eventually brings clarity. He starts realizing the role he has played in the dynamic, the effort he has neglected, and the value of someone who remains composed, independent, and confident even in the face of distance. Curiosity becomes awareness, and awareness triggers a reassessment of feelings and priorities. The power of silence is in its ability to shift perspective without words, without confrontation, and without emotional urgency. It provides space for internal reflection, forces the mind to recognize value, and encourages respect for independence. When handled with calm confidence rather than anxiety or overcompensation, silence becomes a tool of transformation, both for the person who steps back and for the person observing it. Ultimately, understanding that silence is often a product of internal conflict and reflection allows you to see it not as rejection, but as a sign of emotional processing. It is a space where feelings are examined, attachment is evaluated, and priorities are reconsidered. And when a man finally emerges from that silence, he does so with a deeper awareness of the connection, a clearer understanding of your value, and often a renewed respect and appreciation for the presence he may have once taken for granted. Many men experience deep feelings but lack the emotional language or confidence to express them openly. When emotions become intense, the instinct is often to retreat rather than confront vulnerability directly. Silence becomes a way to process complex feelings, to weigh the connection, and to examine what it truly means to him without the immediate pressure of responding. The mind needs space to analyze, to reflect, and to confront truths that cannot be understood while constantly reacting. This withdrawal is not always about disinterest. In many cases, it occurs because the intensity of the connection has triggered fear. Fear of loss, fear of rejection, fear of inadequacy, and fear of commitment can all manifest as silence. When someone begins to feel that their emotions are serious, real, or potentially permanent, they may not yet know how to navigate the responsibility that comes with those feelings. Retreating temporarily allows the mind to prepare for emotional decisions in a controlled, private way. Silence also forces perspective. When a person steps back, it creates the opportunity to evaluate the relationship objectively. Without constant engagement, the mind begins noticing patterns, actions, and dynamics that may have previously been overlooked. He begins to reflect on your energy, your presence, and the moments you contributed to the connection. Small details like the patience you showed, the support you offered, or the consistency you displayed start carrying new weight. Memories that felt ordinary now appear meaningful, and the realization of your value becomes clearer in the absence of constant interaction. Another critical aspect of this silence is that it highlights emotional contrast. When attention becomes predictable, human psychology often undervalues it. Constant reassurance can unintentionally reduce perceived significance. But when attention becomes scarce or unpredictable, it signals that the connection is not guaranteed. This scarcity forces the mind to recognize the importance of what was previously taken for granted. It awakens curiosity, reflection, and even admiration. Internal conflict is intensified when a man begins comparing what he feels with what he sees. He notices your confidence, independence, and composure. He sees that your life is moving forward. Your energy is not entirely dependent on his presence, and your priorities exist beyond the relationship itself. That observation triggers deeper reflection. He begins realizing that while he withdrew for clarity or protection, the connection he may have underestimated continues to thrive. This realization awakens a sense of respect and emotional urgency that did not exist when he assumed attention was unlimited. Silence also acts as a mirror for his own behavior. When someone steps back emotionally, it allows him to evaluate whether his own effort has been sufficient. He begins noticing moments when he may have been distant, inconsistent, or disengaged. The lack of immediate feedback forces self-awareness. Without your emotional energy being constantly available, he must confront the imbalance in the dynamic that he may have ignored before. Curiosity naturally grows from reflection. The mind begins to question, why is she so composed? Why does she seem unaffected by my distance? Why does her life continue with such strength and independence? These questions create tension, not because of manipulation, but because the silence has highlighted qualities he may have taken for granted. Emotional absence allows admiration, respect, and attraction to grow in ways constant attention cannot achieve. During this time, he may begin to reassess priorities and the significance of the connection. He recognizes that emotional effort is not unlimited and that meaningful connections require reciprocity. Your calm, independent presence becomes a standard by which he measures his own contributions. The realization is often subtle but profound. Your stability, self-respect, and confidence are signals of value that cannot be replicated through chasing or constant reassurance. This phase of silence ultimately challenges him to confront what he truly wants. It forces him to evaluate whether he is willing to invest effort, commitment, and emotional energy to match the value he sees. If he is capable, the silence can catalyze renewed attention and deeper connection. If he is not, it clarifies the imbalance without requiring conflict or confrontation. The power of silence is amplified when met with patience and self-assuredness. When you maintain composure, continue growing, and preserve your emotional energy, you demonstrate that your worth is not tied to constant validation. This communicates strength, maturity, and independence, qualities that are magnetic and demanding of respect. Ultimately, the third keynote reveals that silence is rarely meaningless. It is a reflection of internal processing, emotional evaluation, and subconscious acknowledgement of value. When a man retreats, it does not always mean absence of feeling. Often, it signifies the weight of feeling and the necessity to confront it privately. Your response to that silence, through confidence, independence, and calm presence, becomes the catalyst that shapes his perception, triggers awareness, and often awakens recognition of the connection's true significance in a way that words alone cannot achieve. Human beings are wired to seek connection, but they are equally wired to retreat when feelings become intense or responsibilities feel heavy. Silence is a natural response to that internal tension. It is a pause, a space for reflection, and a moment to regain equilibrium. When emotions are too complex or the connection feels too significant, withdrawing allows the mind to process without external influence. Many men are not taught to communicate vulnerability effectively. Expressing deep emotions can feel risky, exposing them to judgment, rejection, or a loss of control. When they are uncertain about how to navigate these feelings, silence becomes the default mode. It is a way to contain emotional intensity, to think through what the relationship means, and to determine how to respond without acting impulsively. Silence is a form of internal problem solving, a method to understand emotions without external pressure. This withdrawal often coincides with reflection on the connection itself. When someone steps back, they begin to evaluate the dynamics that existed, noticing patterns of behavior, moments of emotional investment, and the way energy flowed between both people. Actions that were previously taken for granted now appear significant. He begins to consider the patience, kindness, and consistency that were offered, and that reflection can create a growing awareness of value he may have overlooked while constantly engaged in the relationship. Emotional contrast plays a critical role during this period. When someone has been consistently available, their presence can feel ordinary. But when that availability decreases, the mind notices the absence. Scarcity naturally draws attention. It forces the brain to recognize what is no longer guaranteed and to reflect on the true importance of the connection. The quieter you become, the more noticeable your impact. Silence emphasizes the value of presence because it highlights what was once considered normal and now feels rare. Another reason silence occurs is due to the pressure of expectations. If a man feels that every interaction requires effort, explanation, or reassurance, it can create a sense of emotional weight. Constant emotional intensity may feel overwhelming. Silence allows him to regain mental and emotional balance, giving him space to process without the stress of immediate response. He steps back not necessarily out of disinterest, but to regain control over his own emotions and to analyze the situation clearly. During this period, the absence of communication triggers curiosity. The mind begins replaying memories, reassessing interactions, and noticing qualities that were previously overlooked. Confidence, independence, and self-respect become more prominent when the other person does not react with desperation or neediness. This lack of dependence communicates a level of emotional maturity that naturally attracts attention. Emotional stability signals strength, and strength creates intrigue. Reflection during silence also forces self-awareness. He begins to examine his own behavior, noticing moments when he may have been inconsistent, distracted, or emotionally unavailable. Without the constant feedback of communication, he cannot ignore his own role in the dynamic. Awareness of past actions grows clearer in the quiet. He begins to understand how much effort, patience, and understanding he may have taken for granted. The psychological effect of distance is powerful because it shifts perspective. When attention is constant, the brain can undervalue it. But when attention is withheld, appreciation grows. Silence makes the presence of someone confident and independent feel rare and significant. The absence of emotional need encourages reflection, curiosity, and reevaluation of priorities. The connection is no longer assumed. It must be consciously valued. During this phase, emotional admiration often begins to replace indifference. As he notices that the other person is capable of living fully, maintaining composure, and thriving independently, he recognizes qualities that are magnetic and rare. Independence, calm confidence, and self-directed energy create a sense of respect that cannot be commanded but can only be felt. He begins to see the person not as someone waiting to be pursued, but as someone whose life, energy, and presence carry inherent value. Silence is ultimately a catalyst for awareness and reflection. It removes distractions, highlights emotional contrasts, and allows space for self-assessment. A man who goes silent is often processing, evaluating, and recognizing the significance of what he may have overlooked. The most powerful response to this silence is not panic or overcompensation, but calm confidence and continued self-respect. When this energy is maintained, the connection transforms, and the person who initially withdrew begins to see the true value of someone whose presence is meaningful, independent, and deeply impactful. This is why silence carries such immense power. It forces reflection, awakens curiosity, and highlights emotional significance. It allows the mind to notice patterns, reassess priorities, and recognize the value of someone who is capable of maintaining balance, strength, and independence regardless of external attention. In this quiet space, respect, attraction, and awareness grow naturally, creating a dynamic that words alone could never achieve. Many men struggle to express vulnerability openly, and when emotions intensify, retreating becomes a natural response. Silence provides a space where thoughts can be processed without external pressure. It allows him to analyze the connection, consider his own feelings, and determine what the relationship truly means to him. The withdrawal is rarely random. It is a deliberate internal mechanism to regain clarity and control over emotions. This silence often begins when he experiences emotional conflict. He may feel drawn to the connection, yet simultaneously uncertain about the responsibilities it demands. Emotional intensity can create hesitation because deep feelings bring the possibility of hurt, rejection, or failure. For someone not used to confronting these realities head-on, stepping back provides a controlled environment to process these complexities. Silence becomes a tool for self-regulation, a way to navigate vulnerability without losing balance. Reflection is a major element of this process. When communication slows or stops, he begins replaying past interactions in his mind, noticing patterns, moments of support, patience, and consistency that may have been taken for granted before. Small actions, gestures, and words that once seemed ordinary begin to carry weight. The mind starts connecting dots, realizing the significance of the emotional energy that was present but unappreciated. This reflection is intensified by absence because without constant interaction, the mind is forced to observe and assess without distraction. Silence also highlights emotional contrast. Predictable attention often diminishes perceived value while absence creates awareness. When someone who is always available becomes less reachable, the rarity of their presence becomes more noticeable. This psychological principle is powerful because it forces the brain to reassess the connection. Attention, respect, and emotional investment are suddenly viewed as finite resources, and scarcity makes them feel more valuable. The person stepping back does not need to assert worth through words. The absence itself communicates significance. Internal evaluation during silence often triggers curiosity. He begins to notice independence, composure, and self-directed energy. Observing that someone's life continues confidently without constant reassurance forces awareness of their strength. Emotional stability becomes magnetic not because it is imposed, but because it is genuine. The qualities that emerge in calm, independent behavior are rare and attractive, and they compel reflection about the connection and the value of the person exhibiting them. Another aspect of this silence is self-awareness. The lack of immediate feedback forces him to confront his own behavior, including moments of inattention, inconsistency, or disengagement. Without the constant presence of emotional reactions, he cannot ignore his own contribution to the dynamic. This heightened self-awareness can trigger realization, acknowledgement of past mistakes, and recognition of the effort, patience, and emotional investment that were offered consistently but perhaps underappreciated. The power of distance is magnified because it allows perspective to develop. Constant engagement can normalize attention, reducing its emotional impact. When attention becomes scarce, appreciation naturally grows. The presence of someone independent, confident, and composed feels significant because it is no longer assumed. Emotional contrast awakens reflection, curiosity, and recognition of the connection's value. Absence is not merely a lack, it becomes a lens through which significance is revealed. During this period, admiration often begins to grow. He sees that the other person's happiness, growth, and stability are not dependent on his attention. This independence is both inspiring and magnetic, signaling emotional maturity and strength. The realization dawns that the connection he initially undervalued contains qualities that are rare, meaningful, and worth protecting. This awareness challenges previous assumptions, forcing him to reconsider the depth of his feelings. Silence functions as a catalyst for transformation. It removes distraction, highlights value, and creates a mental environment where reflection, curiosity, and self-awareness naturally occur. The person who maintains composure, independence, and confidence during this time communicates worth without words, influence without manipulation, and power without aggression. This dynamic shifts perception, strengthens attraction, and awakens recognition of the true significance of the connection. Ultimately, the fifth keynote demonstrates that silence is rarely meaningless. It is an active period of processing, reflection, and internal evaluation. When handled with calm confidence and self-respect, it becomes a transformative force. The person who initially withdrew is compelled to recognize value, reassess priorities, and appreciate the rare qualities of someone whose presence is impactful, independent, and emotionally grounded. Silence reveals significance, strengthens respect, and naturally commands attention without ever demanding it. When feelings intensify, many men feel the need to withdraw in order to sort through their emotions, evaluate the connection, and determine their next course of action. This internal reflection requires space, calm, and mental clarity, which cannot be achieved under constant external pressure. Silence is frequently triggered by a combination of desire and uncertainty. Attraction may be strong, yet the responsibilities, expectations, or vulnerabilities tied to emotional attachment can feel overwhelming. The mind instinctively creates distance to regain a sense of control. This withdrawal is not necessarily an indication of diminished interest. Rather, it is a mechanism to prevent impulsive reactions that could compromise the relationship or reveal insecurities prematurely. During this period of silence, reflection becomes inevitable. The mind begins analyzing past conversations, actions, and patterns of behavior. He notices how you carried yourself, the patience you displayed, the energy you invested, and the consistency with which you approached the connection. Small gestures that may have once seemed ordinary now take on new meaning. This reflection forces recognition of qualities that were previously overlooked and awakens an awareness of the true value of the person who has maintained composure, independence, and emotional stability. Silence also creates emotional contrast, which is a powerful psychological trigger. When attention was constant and predictable, it was taken for granted. But when availability decreases, the mind begins to measure its absence. recognizing the significance of a presence that is no longer guaranteed. This contrast brings clarity, forcing him to see the connection through a lens of value rather than habit. The lack of immediate response or engagement communicates strength, self-respect, and independence, qualities that cannot be conveyed through words alone. Internal conflict intensifies during silence. He may feel torn between desire and fear, attraction and hesitation, responsibility and avoidance. This conflict forces introspection. He begins questioning past behavior, evaluating whether he gave the connection the effort, attention, and respect it deserved. Memories of moments when patience, loyalty, or understanding were shown may resurface, and he begins realizing how much was offered without expectation. This self-awareness often triggers deeper appreciation for the person he once underestimated. Silence naturally fosters curiosity. Observing that someone continues to thrive, remain confident, and live independently despite the emotional distance challenges assumptions and compels reflection. The mind begins to recognize the strength it previously overlooked. Independence becomes magnetic because it signals emotional maturity, stability, and self-respect, qualities that cannot be manufactured or demanded. Emotional curiosity grows, leading to a heightened awareness of the connection and a deeper consideration of personal feelings. Another critical aspect of this silence is that it forces accountability. Without constant communication or reassurance, he cannot ignore the reality of the dynamic. He must confront his own role, decisions, and behavior within the relationship. He becomes aware of moments where he may have been inattentive, inconsistent, or disengaged. This realization often leads to internal reflection, reconsideration, and recognition of the effort and energy that were consistently invested by the other person. The power of silence lies in its ability to reveal emotional priorities. When someone maintains calm, independence, and confidence in the face of distance, it communicates that their worth is not tied to constant validation. This unspoken strength demands recognition and creates an emotional awakening. The connection is no longer assumed, it is consciously evaluated. The mind begins to reassess the significance of the person who can remain composed, self-respecting, and centered, even when attention is withheld. Silence also allows reflection on personal desires and emotional readiness. He begins to question whether he is prepared to invest the energy, attention, and commitment that the connection deserves. The absence highlights what is meaningful, and curiosity grows into awareness. The realization that the person he stepped away from is emotionally stable, independent, and confident creates respect and often triggers a desire to reconnect with genuine effort. Ultimately, the sixth keynote demonstrates that silence is not a void but a catalyst. It provides space for reflection, fosters curiosity, encourages self-awareness, and awakens recognition of value. When someone responds to silence with confidence, composure, and independence, it transforms the dynamic entirely. The person who withdrew begins to see the connection through a lens of respect, admiration, and clarity, realizing the significance of someone whose presence is impactful, self-assured, and emotionally grounded. Silence, when understood and met wisely, becomes one of the most powerful forces in shaping perception, deepening respect, and reinforcing the value of a meaningful connection.